Welcome to the launch of Pure Tech Talks, where we explore wide-ranging topics of technology with our customers and partners. As many of you might know, my name is Jimmy Tam. I'm the CEO of Pure Software, and I'm very proud today to have our first inaugural guest for Pure Tech Talk, Episode 1, being Dwayne LaFlotte, CTO Pulsar Security. Hi, Dwayne. How are you doing today?
Hey Jimmy, how are you? Yeah, I'm honored to be the first guest. I'm super excited. I think this is going to be huge for understanding security and unstructured data and all sorts of stuff. So, but we'll jump into all that, I'm sure.
Right. As some of you may know from who are listening here, Dwayne actually used to be the CTO of Pure Software, but he left us a few years ago to follow his passions into the world of security. So, Dwayne, over the last few years, we've talked a lot, but our customers haven't heard about what Pulsar Security has been up to. Could you, for the audience today, tell them a little bit more about Pulsar? What's the company's focus and what services you guys provide, so that if they are in need of cybersecurity services, they know when to reach out to you guys.
Yeah, absolutely, Jimmy. And so Pulsar Security is where we like to think of ourselves as the boogeymen of the internet, dark and scary, but at least show you where the issues are. So our security offerings are generally around companies come to us and say, hey, we're interested in understanding what our vulnerability is. What if a nation state were to attack us? Let's say it's either Russia or whoever wants to attack our company. What would our risk be? Or just a ransomware gang wants to attack us. What's our risk? So what Pulsar Security does is twofold. One, we have what's called offensive red teaming. So it sounds very militaristic, and it kind of is, where we will, offensively try and breach an organization, break into firewalls and websites and do phishing emails and try and trick people into doing things that they shouldn't do on the network. But our second sort of calling is using all of our understanding of how to write and execute malicious software into educating customers and getting them to understand what the security risks are. And that's actually one of the reasons I'm super excited about being able to talk to you guys today, because I think there's a great intersection between education and keeping customers safe, and then what you guys do. So
Awesome. So would you say that most of the time customers engage you for consulting projects? Are these ad hoc projects, or are they kind of like, do you follow the customer's journey over multiple years?
That's a great question. So it's a little bit of both. Typically what we'll have is customers come to us and say, hey, I'm very interested in a particular project. Like, I need you guys to come in and assess over, say, a 2-week period, how risky our environment is externally as well as internally. What could you get access to? And everybody kind of gives us a different target, the crown jewels, if you will, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later. And then what we find is typically then customers will year after year have us come back and retest, make sure things are even more secure than they were in the past. So those projects can range short projects all the way to, staying with a customer for an entire year and understanding what their security risk is and how they mature.
So it sounds like, for a lot of customers, are they coming to you guys before any type of security breaches occurred? Or do you find that most customers come to you after the fact? It's kind of like buying an insurance after the accident.
Right. I love this question, because you'd like to think that everybody's like, hey, you know what? Yeah. We really should worry about security, right? Yeah. And then they come to you and go, you know what? Nothing's happened. Everything's smooth. But can you guys come take a look? That'd be great. Unfortunately, what typically happens is we'll call potential customers or leads or whatnot and say, hey, you should worry about cybersecurity. And it's always like, you know what? You don't worry about it until it happens. It's like flood insurance, right? You're like, oh, well, if it doesn't really flood here that often, do I need flood insurance? So it's the same type of thing where they go, I think we're okay. And then inevitably something happens. And there's a breach or a leak of data or something along those lines. And then they call us up and they go, hey, remember when we were talking about that thing about securing the company? And you're like, guys, like, this is so much better as a proactive thing rather than a reactive thing. Like I said, I'd like to say that customers come to us beforehand, but more often than not, an incident has proven how important cybersecurity may be. And then they reach out to us to help secure.
I've read just in a recent article just the other day that a lot of the ransomware or malware these days, once it gets infested into a network, it might lay dormant for a period of time, and then they would start. Some trigger event will get them started later on because they don't want to be too intrusive into networks, so they get detected very soon. So, do you find that even for those customers that thought that they were being very proactive and called you before they got breached, then when you get in, you realize, oh my gosh, they've actually been breached. They just don't know it yet. Has that occurred? Is that
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Even to the point where usually in our contract with the customer, if we're engaged doing an offensive red teaming engagement and we're breaking into a customer, there's two like all hands stop events. One of them is, while we were doing our testing, a particular service or whatnot might be under load, and they call us up and say, hey, we got to stop the testing on this particular server until nighttime or whatever, just because it's causing issues. But the second all stop event is on our side, where we say, listen, if we find another team in there, whether it's a nation state or ransomware or whatnot, that's an all stop. We will call you and immediately start going into mitigation. And we do find it oddly a fair bit, where we go in and see stuff where we go, that's weird. You guys didn't do this over here. And they're like, oh no, let's go take a look at that. So it is interesting. And one of the things I want to tell you, Jimmy, is the ransomware gangs and malicious software developers are very, very, very crafty and very bright. So the thought out there is, it's just somebody writes a random piece of code and throws it out there and it maybe infect one or two people. And it's just not the case. There are entire industries supporting malware and ransomware development, to the point where you and I, Jimmy, if we wanted to quit our respective companies, we could go into the ransomware business. And we don't need to know a lick of technology. All we need to do is go buy ransomware as a service. And there's massive organizations out there that create ransomware for us. And then we'll take it and they give us these parameters, we can modify it. And then we can try and run it, but we don't even have to test it. We can send it back to a different company that will QA it for us and will tell us what how fast it will propagate and whether it gets detected by certain antivirus and that sort of stuff. And then they make suggestions on how you and I might fix our code to make it better. And then we fix our code. And then when we send it out, either in emails or whatnot, which there's another service that will do that for you. If we run into issues, they have 24/7 support. Or we could just call them and say, hey, you know what, Jimmy and I are a little upset. We only saw 100,000 new infections today. And they'll be like, no problem, Dwayne, you know what, we'll let's take a look at your code. Let's see how we might fix that a little bit better. You might get better detection over here if you do this and etc. So really, that's
is that legal? Is that a legal industry?
Entirely
or is this
not
on the
legal.
Dark web? Oh, no.
Entirely not legal. But it's
Okay.
interesting from a standpoint of, like, it used to be just a small group of people who'd write this malware and ransomware, send it out, and maybe it reaches wide, but it's probably not. But now you've got organizations supporting them, so it's a daunting task to try and protect against these things.
So this just could be like a mom and pop shop who decided to set up a ransomware company. And actually, I was reading online yesterday. There was a Vietnamese from Vietnam, a Vietnamese hacker couple that breached a hotel chain, right? And they couldn't really get deep enough to take some of the stuff they wanted, so they decided to cause a mess inside. So is that what you're saying, that these people who are probably not coders themselves are able to just kind of like latch on to this industry?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's weird is, like, so they may be able to breach a certain part of the organization, and then they start digging around and they're like, you know what, I'm just going to run our ransomware. We'll encrypt everything, and then they just have to pay us to decrypt it. So it's just quick hit. It's like a smash and grab, if you will, if they can break into an organization and get something to run. Actually, recently, the LA school district. So near and dear, I know, to your heart, but the LA school district is the second largest school district in the United States. 650,000 end users, I think. So that's students K through 12. And they got hacked. The hackers went instantly for the financials database. And when they couldn't go find the financial, and it was financial database as well as financial contracts with external vendors. And then they just ran some ransomware. So it's we're seeing that as a common attack vector. which is interesting.
So from your work, I mean, what would you say the preponderance of your work is for most of for customers? Is it more intrusion detection, kind of like securing the walls, or is it more finding and mitigating ransomware and malware, or is it kind of like very balanced across all of them? Because you need all of them, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So from our standpoint, our engineers are highly trained in offensive security. So our job is to break into a company when they have their walls up. So I have several customers who have spent, multiple millions of dollars in cybersecurity and firewalls and cybersecurity teams and a NOC, a network operations center that constantly watches the network, a SOC, security operations center that constantly only watches security. And then they call us and say, okay, break it. What could you get access to with all of this technology watching our network? And that's where, my team, for example, red teaming, is highly trained in creating malicious software. So creating ransomware that won't get detected by antivirus. And surprisingly, Jimmy, it's not that hard. So we can create, at this point, like my team can create a piece of ransomware that does exactly what you said, sits on a network kind of dormant. We have a couple pieces of ransomware that will avoid every piece of antivirus out there. So I know a lot of people hide behind antivirus or endpoint detection systems, EDRs, where they say, oh, well, I'm paying $2 million to this company to detect, whether there's malicious software here, or I'm paying, $1 million to these guys to watch, or I have, this type of antivirus, I'm probably fine. There are ways around all those systems. And that's why we talk more about defense in depth. So our guys being trained in avoiding these systems. Then when we go and talk to partners like yourself, where we're like, okay, this is a fantastic defense in depth as to how we might help protect customers together. So yeah, it's an interesting topic.
You make it sound very doom and gloom, Dwayne. I have to tell you that because it almost seems like, well, they're gonna get in anyways. I shouldn't do anything, right? I shouldn't do anything, or
so,
is there, like, for small companies? I mean, obviously there's small companies, medium companies, and very large companies. Everybody has a different level of resources. So, I mean, it's scary. It's from what you're telling me, it's very scary. For the small companies, what would you say? Where's the start?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we've known each other for many years. So Jimmy's seen my eyes light up in passion when I see the whole internet is burning because there's a brand new virus out or a brand new exploit, and it's always, as the offensive attacker, I'm always like, oh my God, that's so clever, or that's so cool, or oh my God, that's awesome. But you know what? Coming back to that, Jimmy, you're absolutely right. I hate to talk just fear and uncertainty and doubt. And that, unfortunately, in this market, that's what a lot of people do. They're like, oh my God, doom and gloom, this sucks. You're never going to be able to protect it. You might as well just delete all your data. And honestly, that's not true. There are some very, very simple steps you can take as a small to medium organization that will infinitely make your security much harder for an external entity to breach. Some of it's around things like password management and policies around that. Do you manage passwords? Do you change passwords? Do you have a password manager that's holding complex passwords for you, just trying to, I'll tell you, for example, whoever's listening to this podcast right now, if you're using fall 2022 as your password, come on, change it. And we see it a lot. It's always season and then year because they have to change it every quarter. So like, fall 2022, spring 2023. And you're like, it's like one of the first passwords we test. So password management is a simple way to help really drastically make your organization much more secure. But then on top of that, defense in depth, small things that help, making sure your firewalls are reviewed, making sure you have a backup plan and a disaster recovery plan, making sure your data is in multiple locations so that if one location goes down, the other locations are up and still running and you have business continuity. Simply just putting these plans in place sadly makes you ahead of most organizations out there that we talk to.
You mentioned password protection. Would you then say, like, two-factor authentication is very prevalent across almost everything these days? So is that almost a requirement now? Is that a must, or is there
Oh,
some weaknesses in that
yeah.
as well?
No, absolutely. Okay, so first I'll tell you, Jimmy, there's weaknesses.
In
Weaknesses will come out in
everything.
everything.
Yeah, yeah.
However, you're absolutely right. I love the way you phrase that as is it a bare minimum? Because it used to be, listen, multiple users were using a system back in the Windows 95 days. For us old guys, back in the Windows 95 days, right? You just used a username. You didn't even need a password on a system, and that was so that you could separate your data. And then it got to, oh well, the bare minimum can't just be username. It has to be username and password. Right. And then it became, now it is username, password, and MFA. You're absolutely right. You absolutely need multi-factor authentication. Can it be bypassed? It can. It's hard, but it can be done. Most of the time it's tricking the end user. Actually, that's what happened with the Uber hack just recently, was literally tricking an end user into accepting a multi-factor authentication push to their phone. But without that, your organization is really susceptible to being breached. With MFA, according to Google and Microsoft, there was an article that they both had put out separately about how MFA mitigates about 99.2% of all of the attacks on a particular organization. Just putting MFA in doesn't mean it's perfect, but it's actually pretty huge for helping out.
Right. Very interesting. And on that same note, do you see more people, we always hear about artificial intelligence and machine learning more and more these days, looking for behavior patterns outside of just, I put in my username, password, I got my two-factor authentication. But hey, I'm logging in on Sunday at 3:37 a.m. In a city that I've never been to. Do you see that kind of layering on top of it? And is that beyond the capabilities of a small to medium organization and only reserved for the large organizations that have like a data scientist?
So that's a hot topic. It's interesting because what we typically do in the security world is we look at who has the most money and the most to protect, and it usually ends up being the military. And we're looking for a trend. What are they doing in the military potentially that would then be translatable into small to medium and large businesses that could help security posture of those organizations? And behavioral analysis is huge right now. I'll tell you, there's a story of my CEO, Patrick Hines, who we both know actually very well. He was, West Point graduate, knows a lot of military, has a bunch of 2- and 4-star generals that he knows. And in talking to some of those guys, he said, one of the guys he was talking to came back from vacation and had gotten bitten by a spider on vacation. Came back from vacation, got bitten by a spider, and when he went to log into his computer on the military base, because his typing cadence was off, MPs came in and were like, you know what, your typing cadence is off. So we wanted to check and make sure that it was actually so what you're saying is just dead set right on the line for where security is going and especially the military takes it to that nth degree of, well, it doesn't matter that you're in your office and it is business hours, your typing cadence is off and we're going to come in and say hi and see what you're actually doing. But for a small to medium business, there are plenty of ways for them to adopt platforms, which I know we'll talk later about M.E.D, which I personally love the paradigm it does there. But there are tons of software out there that would do those types of things. I know if you look at like Google and Azure, Microsoft and Google services, they do a lot of those things already built in for logins, right? So if you try and log in from if I log in from LA and then 10 minutes later I log in from Russia, they go, yeah, you know what? Yeah. That's not probably not a good thing, and they shut down the account, or they make you authenticate even further with your phone or your MFA device. So yeah, there's a lot of really good services out there that do that. But absolutely, I think machine learning and behavioral analysis, you got to avoid the buzzwords because everybody wants to use them, but there are some really good technologies out there that use them appropriately that will help.
You had also mentioned about firewall reviews. Can you describe that more in depth? Is this something that your firewall vendor should be doing for you, or is this something that this is a service that most companies should be looking for? It's kind of like Right, like it's if the firewall companies reviews it for you, are they checking their own work, or
Yeah.
should you have somebody else who's a third party independent company come in and do it? What's the best practice there?
So it's going to sound self-serving, but it is one of the reasons we offer this type of thing as a service is because honestly, third-party vendors should be double checking your work. And I'll give you a couple examples without any names. But there was one company, a school district. I won't talk about who they are. And the company that designed and implemented their network was also the same company that was checking the firewall rules and checking everything out. And they said, you know what? The guys who implemented did awesome. And you're like, okay, but you're the guys who implemented it. So of course you're going to say you did awesome. When we went in to pen test the environment, it took us about 15 minutes to gain access to the entire environment, all students, grades, all like everything. Honestly, yeah, having a third party, and you know what, I'll even go further, Jimmy. There are a couple large organizations like Fortune 500 organizations we work with doing offensive red teaming. And when we've done offensive red teaming with them 1 or 2 years in a row, we usually recommend they don't use us as a vendor. We say, hey, you shouldn't use us. Go use somebody else for a year or two and come back. Because we have a myopic view of what we're looking at, and we get that tunnel vision. So, if you've implemented it, you can't look at it. You really need somebody else to look at it, and switching vendors is a good idea to take a look at stuff.
So to recap there, so you would say, for a small company then, you'd start off, definitely take a look at password management, two-factor authentication, obviously being at least a minimum. Make sure your firewalls are set well and set right. Probably make sure all your backup, data protection, your snapshots, you can kind of recover it just in case something does occur. That's the bare minimum for small companies then.
Yes.
And for medium and larger companies, then having companies, third-party companies like yourselves, do some red teaming, some reviews, and then switching up your vendors every single few years is kind of like the best practice then. Is that kind of like how you would say small, medium, large to kind of like progress?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you hit the nail right on the head because, honestly, doing those things, a lot of those sound very simple, like password management, like, making sure you have backup copies. Like, we've been in the industry for decades. And these are the things people have always talked about. But doing those, honestly, it's surprisingly and shocking how many organizations don't follow just those bare minimums. And B, following those bare minimums is definitely going to make your organization much more mature in a security posture. And listen, the hackers are typically looking for the easiest mark. I always love to use the bear analogy. You hear the joke about bear comes up and is starting to chase a couple campers, and one guy starts to run, another guy sits down to put his shoes on, his running shoes on. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "I don't have to outrun the bear. I have to outrun you." Same, right? Same type of thing here. Like in a security posture, what you need to do is make sure that you are not as easy to breach as another organization in your space, and they'll go after them, sadly. So, yeah.
Do you see that? You see, hackers just kind of go after a company, and then after a little bit, they go, it's just too hard. Let me move on to the next one. So you see that attack actually subsiding and then moving on?
So I'd say yes. However, then a new attacker tries, and then they subside, and a new attacker tries. So it becomes this constant. But you do see it start shifting from attacker to attacker to attacker because they just can't get anywhere, and they're like, you know what? There are a lot of easier targets on the internet. I don't need to worry about trying to reach these guys.
Makes sense. We've also talked, previously, there's, it seems so daunting for a lot of companies. Because there's so many different attack vectors and ways to attack a company that you can't protect everything. So if you can't protect everything, especially for companies looking at it going, well, I don't have unlimited resources, Dwayne. I don't have unlimited resources. What should I focus on then? What are the crown jewels, like we had mentioned previously? Like what are hackers usually trying to get to? Is it the databases? Is it HR records? What is it?
That's a great question too, because we always start with this when we're talking about red teaming with a company. We go, okay, great. What are you trying to protect? Like, what if you lost today and it got encrypted and it was gone? Like, couldn't get it back? Would you just say, you know what, we got to close the doors. We're done here. And those are what we kind of dub the crown jewels. What's our target? And typically, that's the target of my red team. So they say, okay, come in here, and if you can get X, then we know we're in trouble, right? Yeah, you get some information about our end users, okay, whatever. You get a couple ancillary, access to a database that doesn't matter, fine, we don't care. But if you can get access to this thing. What's interesting is there's a couple different ways I love to look at this paradigm. One, when we're dealing with red teaming customers, 9 times out of 10, what they point us at, especially in the Fortune 500 space, is file data. It's unstructured file data. So a lot of people think, okay, well, it's going to be databases, right? That's where all the crown jewels are. But there's so much in contracts and signed documents and all of these things. A lot of the ransomware gangs out there that are deploying ransomware and or malware, they're not only looking for a quick payday, but what they're also looking for is data that they can use to leverage against you. And that typically is in unstructured data, right? That might be contracts with particular types of vendors. That might be how much you're paying employees, and they have those signed documents that there might be up in an HR share. So that's typically what we see customers say, okay, well, we're a massive company with a massive database over here, but what we really are worried about is somebody getting access to this file share over here, or somebody getting access to, these technical documents that we have around what our, intellectual property is and the things we do. So typically we see that crown jewels, if you will, usually being unstructured data. Now, the second prong to that, Jimmy, is not only do we listen to our customers, because, there's a lot of times where the customer goes, yeah, I think it's this, but, it's either a really large company, so it's hard to tell what the crown jewels are, or it's a small organization. They say, I'm just worried about everything. Right. So how do we then track the crown jewels there? And what I like to do, how we look at the military for what the best sort of strategy and security might be. We then look at the ransomware gangs to see what are they targeting, right? What are the things that they try and get access to? And I tell you, I was just on a forensics case. And I here again, I won't use names, and I love these guys, but there's a company we were dealing with. And we were talking to them and we said, hey, listen, we should look at this system. We should look at this system. We got to look at this system. And they said, yeah. No, we know, we got to look at it. But you know what? We're busy right now. Let's do it next month. We say, okay. And we come back next month and say, hey, we still got that system we want to look at. They go, yeah, but we'll look at it. But just not right now. I was like, okay, cool. And then I got a call, frantic on a Friday night, and they go, hey, you know that system? And I was like, yeah. They're like, it got breached in ransomware. Do you mind looking at it? I was like, oh, gosh. So looking at that system and forensics gives us a really good understanding of what the ransomware gangs are targeting. So this was a system that had a SQL server, so it had a database on the back end that had some pretty good and interesting information and authentication tokens, all sorts of cool stuff in there. Stuff I, as the hacker, will always try and look for. And then had a bunch of unstructured data that was sitting on the drive. And the unstructured data in this particular case, this was an application server, so there wasn't a lot of sort of really juicy things on there from the unstructured data side. But the ransomware didn't know that. So when the ransomware came in, the moment it ran, it instantly shut down the database. And I was like, you know what? It was probably doing that to encrypt the database. That's what they were going for. They were going for the database. And then I opened the database up and it wasn't encrypted. And I was like, wow, that's weird. Then we started following the path, and this particular ransomware said, nope, I don't care about the database. The reason they had shut it off is so that people couldn't monitor and watch what they were doing. They were assuming there was some sort of security software logging in that database. But what they were really going after was unstructured data. They instantly tried to encrypt as much of the file data as they possibly could, and then bailed, never actually went over and touched the database or anything along those lines. For two reasons. One, they're going to try and exfil this data. So they're going to try and pull the data off the system if they can, so they can use it as leverage against you. We saw this in the Uber hack where they said, hey, you know what? We have umpteen hundreds of gigs worth of data that we've pulled off your network. Here's a small slice. And they threw some information out on the dark web just to prove we did get access and we do have these files. Databases are massive. So for them to pull an entire database down, if the connection gets interrupted halfway through, you got nothing. So they're targeting that ransomware. A is targeting unstructured files. A, so that they can then use that as leverage against you. And B, anything they get off the servers is actionable, something they can use. So we start to see these trends in ransomware where unstructured data is primarily where they go first. And then a lot of times after that, you're absolutely right. We talk about ransomware sitting there dormant. A lot of them will then sit there as because ransomware gangs will sell access to the organization in what they call initial access brokers. So I, as a ransomware vendor, may go out and run my ransomware, encrypt something, and then stay dormant in the system so I can give other hackers access to the environment if I want to. So yeah, interesting.
But when you talk about that exfiltration, if a ransomware gang is exfiltrating a ton of data, wouldn't the network team start seeing like a ton of traffic flows out of the organizations more than normal? Because if you're talking about a small company, maybe sure, fine. They might not have a ton of data, but a small, a medium or large company that has, hundreds of terabytes, petabytes of data. If you're exfiltrating that much, I would imagine the network team would see something.
You would like to think so. However, there are so many ways for me to exfiltrate the data. Take, for example, this. We had one customer that had an entirely locked down network where they weren't allowing us to pull anything into the environment. So we were on a jump station. I couldn't put any of my normal tools on there to sort of compromise the network and that sort of stuff. But what I was able to do was to exfiltrate data and infiltrate data, pull tools in through DNS. So let me unpack that a little bit. Yeah. So instead of going over HTTP or HTTPS, pulling down web data, I make a DNS request, and we know, if you try and go to www.microsoft.com, like an IP address comes back. But what if I try and go to a really long hex address .hacker.com? Well, that really long hex address makes it to the hacker's DNS server, and then they take that and they reassemble it as a file. So those hex bits are literally the file. So you say, okay, it's really hard for a network team to go, wow, we see there's 20% more DNS requests out there. People must be browsing a lot, right? Yeah. Not really. So it's a hard game to play at the network layer. At the, once the data starts going out, there's so many ways to pump that data out. You really have to catch it before that.
And so you try to hopefully catch it then at the file layer, right? And that's where, Pure Software and Pulsar Security have partnered on malicious event detection, what we call M.E.D. Yes. Can you explain to the audience today who may or may not be familiar with M.E.D, what it is, what the original genesis was, and why do you think there's kind of like a good, interesting, novel, unique, sophisticated idea for the market?
I love it. Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I think M.E.D's is a very cool technology and plays very well in this defense in depth. So as Jimmy had said, I under his tutelage, actually Pure was one of my first CTO positions. And talking together about, okay, we handle this unstructured data, and wouldn't it be great? And security's always been a passion of mine. Wouldn't it be great if we could understand how applications are accessing this data and what that might mean and what the ramifications are, and start applying this type of learning to understanding how the unstructured data is accessed in an environment and whether it might be malicious. And that sort of was the inception of where the malicious event detection came from. And there are a couple things I love about the way it operates. First off, we had talked about, listen, if you can't protect everything all the time, and there's no panacea, there's no one piece of software out there, I'm going to put in, Microsoft Windows Defender and we're all protected and that's fantastic. It just doesn't happen. Security is such an evolving and ever-moving target that you have to have defense in depth. Bare minimum, you have to have password management and you have to have MFA. Bare minimum, you have to have some sort of antivirus. Bare minimum, you have to have an endpoint detection that understands whether your client computers are breached in some way. Somebody's doing, weird malicious things on the clients. Bare minimum, though, you also have to be understanding what's happening with your file data, because sadly, a lot of the viruses are reasonably predictable in what they do. So if I take, say, I don't know, any of the Conti ransomware. Conti ransomware looks it does a depth search in a tree, so it tries to go as deep as it possibly can, gets a list of each file in that tree, and then starts encrypting them sequentially. How is it people aren't finding that when that happens, like, does a normal end user do that? Listen, I want to get a list of every file in these directories, and then I want to touch them all in order. Right? No, that doesn't happen. Right? So take that simple example. Why isn't there a technology layered on top of the unstructured file system that understands, hey, this access paradigm is unique and not something we've seen before and is potentially malicious? And that's really kind of to at the high level what M.E.D is. It's that layer of behavioral analysis that lets us know whether these files are being accessed in a way they aren't typically accessed, while not using signatures. Because that's the other thing. Let me unpack that a little bit. Like a lot of sort of your antivirus and that sort of stuff, companies, what they do is they take a virus, they look for a signature. Hey, have we seen this executable before? Oh, it's bad. Don't run it. What we're doing is taking a look at the pattern, but not of the executable, of the access, and understanding what that means, and then flagging it as potentially malicious, and then on top of that, because of the pure GFS replication structure, even giving you the ability to bring that data back instantly. So there's a lot of really cool things in that M.E.D does. Hopefully that wasn't too much. I know I threw a lot out there because I'm passionate.
So would you say that it's we're to kind of like summarize it a bit, are we analyzing the file access patterns, these these file event streams, and then looking at them and seeing if it looks like a well-known ransomware or malware out there in the marketplace, and if so, then we're going to be stopping the replication from point A to point B and disabling hosts, as an example.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, it's that's another layer in that defense in depth where, it always surprised me that, people watch all the desktops and people watch all the users logging in and what they're running and that sort of stuff. But then there's very few things that sit on the file system or watch a NetApp filer or watch a Nutanix device and say, how is that data being accessed, right? It's like, just seems like such a gap in that defense in depth, especially seeing ransomware targets unstructured data, and that's where the unstructured data lives. And B, we've already kind of established that that's kind of the crown jewels of most organizations is their unstructured data, whether it's HR files to, IP to whatever it may be.
Awesome, thank you. And from us to you, we're very excited to continue working with you on advancements of M.E.D and continuing to analyze ransomware and malware out there in the market and kind of inserting it into pure GFS. Now, though, circling back to outside of just peer and looking at the cybersecurity umbrella that organizations already have, right? Is there, either out in the market or through Pulsar, things that you think customers should do to expand what they're doing? If they already got everything we talked about, from password protection, MFA, firewalls, red teams, M.E.D, what else is out there? I know you've recently launched a new product line as well. Can you kind of talk about that and any other things out there in the market that are interesting?
Yeah, absolutely. And this will still follow down the same sort of paradigm of defense in depth, right? Mm-hmm. There's no, if I had a product that I could tell you, there's this one product out there that will protect you no matter what, just go buy that one thing, then Jimmy and I'd both be working there. So it doesn't exist, right? There's always, as you think about your security posture, there's no security at all, no passwords, whatever. And it's a gradient to, super secure, which is I cut the cable in the back of the computer and nobody can get access to stuff. And nobody wants to be that far over, and nobody wants to be not secure. So it's really where you're comfortable living in the middle, and layering on more and more security to a point where you can still do work, because we all still have to do things for a living, right? We can't just say, hey, it's super secure, but nobody can access the data. So you got to gauge where's the appropriate place in there. So you're right. Let's say we had password management, we had a disaster recovery plan, and we had backup. We had multiple, offsite replications of unstructured data just in case something happens. We have M.E.D in place, so we're doing behavioral analysis of file access, and those M.E.D sort of profiles are constantly being updated with the latest and greatest things that are happening in the market. We have, we have pen tests that are going on where we're checking out our websites, checking out our IPs externally. We have red team engagements going on where we have an external team trying to breach our organization. And on top of that, I'd say the last thing, honestly, is end user training, is making sure that your end users are training. So with that paradigm of we're training our end users, we have a password policy, we have backup and recovery, and we have our plans for doing pen tests and red team, and we have some behavioral analysis. It's a pretty good security stack. So the only thing I would recommend to a normal customer at that point is stay vigilant. Security is not a destination, unfortunately. You're never going to get to, yay, we're at security city and we're good and we don't have to do anything anymore. It's always this journey to being secure. So you're going to continually, new things are going to come out. There's going to be, different tweaks that happen to that secure layer. Maybe it's going to be, bio technology that secures things with fingerprints and retina scans and that sort of stuff. Maybe it's going to be quantum computing where we start talking about quantum analysis. So just realize that the journey to being secure is one you're going to be taking forever. And what you want to do is partner with organizations who have that mindset, who are constantly like, you know what, good enough is not good enough, right? Like Pierre, you know what, when we started working together on M.E.D, Pierre said, I want to know what the latest and greatest pieces of ransomware out there that Dwayne thinks is awesome. And I want us to break it apart, and I want us to take a look at behaviorally what those are doing, and then I want us to be able to protect against those. And that's a never-ending quest that we'll be on. But same thing with all of your other vendors. Honestly, you should be holding your vendors to that same paradigm. If your firewall vendor's like, you know what, yeah, the software we released is fantastic, you don't need to touch it, just leave it alone for the next 10 years and nobody's access anything. Like, we've constantly seen Cisco firewalls, TP-Link firewalls, all of them getting breached because over time, people realize, hey, there's this thing I can do to them. So that would be my one recommendation to an advanced organization is defense in depth. But then also, you really do want to work with partners who have that paradigm of, security is a journey, and we're gonna be more secure the more we deal together. But we're constantly always trying to move forward.
Final question. I know over many drinks over the last years, you've told me a lot of good war stories, and I thought this could be an interesting time to kind of at least share one of them without any names, of course.
Okay.
To the audience, what is the most incredible hacking story that you've ever heard of, either done by yourself or through some bad nation state or hacking team?
I love this question because we usually, usually you're right. No customer names. We won't talk about that. There are some pretty fantastical things that have happened in the global stage of cyber. When we talk about Stuxnet and all sorts of other stuff, but I won't go there because there's a lot to unpack there. Let me talk about our own sort of personal experiences doing some red teaming. So I'll tell you, there's this one customer, very secure, was like, hey, we want you to pen test us. We're interested in understanding whether you can breach our wireless and get access to the network and that sort of stuff. I said, great, we'll do that. And then internally, they went to their blue team, their protection team, and they said, guys, there's this red team who's going to be testing us over the next 2 weeks. Here's what I want us to do. Every 24 hours, we're changing the wireless password. Every 24 hours, we're changing all of our administrative passwords. Like a rigorous security paradigm that nobody would ever follow in the real world, but they knew when the test was going on. So we're like, all right, cool. This is going to be a pretty difficult test. So we, in the first day, within the first 6 hours, we were able to gain access to one of their wireless networks. And we got on the network, but within 24 hours, they shut us off, right? They had changed the password. We didn't have access to the network anymore. We just happened to pop right back on the network. They said, wow, that's weird. Okay, they changed the password. And then they happened to see us pop right back on the network. And after the end of the test, they were like, gosh, what were you doing? Like, how were you getting access to our wireless that quickly? Like, we had patched, we made sure that there was no way you could have gotten access to those routers or exploited them. What were you doing? And I was like, hey, so in your lobby, right? He's like, yeah. I said, you have a TV? He said, yeah. I said, you keep adding it to the network? He said, yeah. I was like, we had breached that TV the first day. And we put a piece of code sitting on the TV that every time you re-added it to the network, it would reach out to us and say, here's the password. So we didn't have to crack it or break it. And he was like, I don't know. I was like, so my suggestion would be don't put the TV on so quickly, or make sure that even your TV is patched, because those types of devices could be a way that we breach the network too. So I always love that story because it's interesting to think of those types of devices. People forget about them, right? And those need to be patched as well.
Which which reminded me, I think I read an article years ago, like one of the most vulnerable aspects in any home network is like these smart devices, these smart light bulbs. People are getting access to your home network through this smart light bulb. So a very similar concept.
I got this device right here. I know those on the podcast won't see it, but I typically, and this is one of those wireless attached power switches. You plug into the wall, and then over Wi-Fi you can turn on or off the device. So I will typically go to like your Walmarts or whatever, and I'll buy one of these and I'll tear it down, and then we'll find a way to break into it. So that way, if we do run into it at a customer's organization, we already know how we break in. Yeah, you're absolutely right. IoT it's a tough thing to secure. So.
Oh my God. Awesome. Well, Dwayne, thank you for joining us on this first inaugural Pure Tech Talk. I appreciate you scaring the living bejesus out of all of our customers, but but at the same time, there is hope. There's hope
Yes.
with doing a lot of good, smart things and partnering with good, smart people. So hopefully, for those out there listening to this, you remember that if you're ever in need of any type of security consulting or solution, reach out to the team at Pulsar Security. They've been fantastic friends and fantastic partners of ours for a very long time. So with that, I bid you adieu. Can't wait for the next security talk with you soon, Dwayne.
Looking forward to it, Jimmy. It was a great talk. I appreciate it. Thanks for having us on here.
Awesome.